We just heard that the government have agreed to roll out the misogyny hate crime counting throughout the country. Behind the scenes, there's a story about how that announcement got made, so I thought I'd share it with you. Last Friday, I had to put in the amendments I wanted to speak on in the final part of the domestic abuse bill. And I just noticed on social media that the Fawcett Society were arguing that there was a misogyny hate crime amendment. And they named the number of that amendment. And I thought, I missed that, so I put my name down for it because I'm opposed to any kind of hate crime legislation, and actually particularly the misogyny hate crime issue. By the end of Friday, I was being lobbied by gender-critical feminists who were noting that actually that amendment didn't mention the word misogyny. And I went and looked at it and I thought, it doesn't mention the word misogyny. In fact, it doesn't mention women. What's going on? So over the last few days, there has been, to say the least, in the build-up to the discussion yesterday, there was a range of contradictory information coming out. So this is what was really going on. There was an amendment put in at the last minute by a Labour baroness that supported an amendment that basically said that based on the perception of hostility or prejudice, the perception being an important point, anyone from any sex or gender would have that counted as a hate crime by the police. I then started to be inundated with emails from the likes of the Fawcett Society, Hope Not Hate, White Ribbon Organisation and various people calling it the misogyny hate crime amendment. And therefore, as far as everyone was concerned, this was an explicit misogyny hate crime discussion. Whereas actually, if you read it, it wasn't. And it was confused by the gender issue, because if that amendment had gone through, it would have meant that women who, for example, were gender critical, who happened to complain in a domestic setting, because it was about the domestic abuse bill, would, if they complained about something, like, for example, they misgendered their son or brother or whatever, they could be done as a hate criminal. And so I wanted to expose that. Okay, I made my speech yesterday, but what's really going on is this. Sarah Everard's killing, murder, brutal, affected us all. I think just because it was our worst nightmare. Any woman will know, even though it's rare that a woman is kidnapped in the public sphere and then brutally murdered in the way that she was, or as far as we understand the way that she was, just the thought of it. So it sums up everything we most fear. But on the other hand, it is a particular rare event, but it's been exploited by everyone. Even when Jess Phillips, and in fact by read out those names, and then also by associating it with the domestic abuse bill, it seems not to matter how women are killed at all, because actually most of those names were women who were killed in domestic settings, which is why you've got the domestic abuse bill. But doesn't Sarah Everard's death count as a particular crime if it just gets lumped into a political moment? Of course, Stella Creasy, who's waiting in the wings, has been trying to get a misogyny hate crime law passed forever. So she is very enthusiastically prepared to sacrifice the word misogyny or hate crime, sponsors the bill in the House of Lords just simply to pressurise the government. In the meantime, another surprise bill comes up in the House of Commons, which effectively will ban protests and demonstrations. Atrocious, outrageous. I'm going to try and amend the bill when it comes to the Lords to get rid of that section. Of course, there's lots of other stuff in there which were promises made by the government in terms of tightening up sentencing. It offends my liberal soul, but I understand that's at least democratic. But this last-minute ban on demonstrations is a problem. The Labour Party oppose, but do they straightforwardly oppose? Oh no. They actually were going to abstain on it, and then they decide we'll use it to push misogyny hate crime legislation. So they go all out to oppose the protest by the new anti-protest law by saying it doesn't mention women. Where's the women issue? We need laws on women, misogyny, hate crime, blah, blah, blah. So you have a situation where the government, instead of staying cool, sticking with whatever they happen to believe as a Conservative government, do deals. So I do my speech yesterday, and the amendment is eventually not voted on because it's announced by the Conservative minister, Baroness Williams of Trafford, who, let's be honest, is hardly like a Conservative minister as one might associate them. because she has agreed with the Lib Dems and the Labour on practically everything in this domestic abuse discussion. But she says, I absolutely agree with you. This is about violence against women and girls. We're going to do something. There is going to be a rollout of the Nottinghamshire domestic abuse hate crime counting. To emphasise, I know that my speech yesterday, which you will not, or you may have heard, hasn't actually pleased the gender critical feminists who have agreed with me about removing the word gender, because they actually, by and large, want a misogyny hate crime legislation. But they were glad that gender was removed from it, and I actually achieved that. That's good, or I kind of forced that discussion in the House of Lords. Good. But on the other hand, I do genuinely think that misogyny hate crime legislation is problematic, because it implies that what drives all violence or any antipathy to women, any violence against women is hatred of women, which I disagree is necessarily the motive. Do we know? No, we don't know. That's one thing. And how are we going to find out? Well, you're not going to find out by asking the victim. And if perception is what drives it, or asking the police to count things which may or may not look like. Also, we're all thinking about Sarah Everard, the worst kind of gross, vile violence. But actually, the counting of crimes that are misogynistic includes uninvited approaches. Excuse me. I mean, how do you know they're uninvited unless you go up and approach? I mean, this could be chatting up, is what I'm trying to say. You might actually be in a situation where it's a catcalling, right? And most people might find that offensive in 2021, but it's relatively trivial, certainly harmless. Some people don't object to it, but that would be counted as a hate crime. And it's thrown into the same basket as the murder of Sarah Everard. This is having a terribly detrimental impact, and I do think that young women are being frightened by this conversation. You know, we say we're having a conversation. By the way, it's a monologue, if not a lecture. You have to agree with the narrative. But I think a lot of young women are being frightened by it. For example, somebody was telling me yesterday that a number of young women have started to complain that their boyfriends aren't checking in on them at the moment. Only a few weeks ago, if their boyfriends had checked in on them, they'd have found that patronising and ridiculous and said, what the hell are you doing? I'm perfectly capable of getting home on my own without you checking in on me. But what's happened is it's become a new mantra, new kind of etiquette about how interpersonal relationships should be carried out. And I think that's wrong. I also think that you should be able to have this conversation. So when people say we've sparked a conversation on attitudes to women, we haven't. We're just getting lectured and say you defy the narrative. In my second speech, I cite Davina McCall, and you know, she's a very famous TV presenter, but she just put a tweet up which said we shouldn't be frightened, we shouldn't lose sense of proportion. But she also noted, what would it be like to be a brother, a son, a partner, a male partner, if basically you're told that you hate women, that you're inherently violent, that you are a risk to everyone. And she said, you know, you've got to think about them as well. People rounded on her. Sisterhood doesn't last that long. Basically, this brand of feminism, victim feminism, refuses to allow that conversation and attacks any women, and there's lots of other examples beyond Davina, including myself, but lots more, of people who don't toe the line being told to shut up. And I just think the fact that Stella Creasy was prepared to sacrifice even the word misogyny and an explicit mention of women in order to get what she wanted in the House of Lords, that they were prepared to use the very important attack on civil liberties and the ban on protests to push their anti-misogyny hate crime fact. The fact that the government don't consider, but react to popular pressure from lobbyists, let's be honest, I think is pretty damaging for democracy. It's not good for women either. And I think that what we need to do is to honour Sarah Everard by not exploiting her death to push political agendas we agree with. And if we want to remember her, we should remember that it's worth having a conversation, of course, about her. One person's death can prompt a conversation, but that conversation needs to be nuanced, prepared to hear all sides, and needs not to pressurise government to do things which it just does to keep everybody happy, but actually might well be ill-advised. Watch this space, because hate crime legislation is going to be very much on the agenda, and watch this place because I think for the next few months or weeks at least, the issue around women is going to be exploited by people who've got an agenda and hobby horses to push through all sorts of pieces of legislation that are not necessarily in the best interests of women, but just a particular group of feminists who've got a particular angle. I'll be trying to keep my eye on it and reveal it to you. But as you can tell, I'm angry. And I'm angry because I don't like the idea of women's oppression, which absolutely exists, being exploited for a particular brand of feminism to push its agenda, and a useless, weak government that goes along with it.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.